The Great Depression. Hey guys, so do you know what the Great Depression means? If you consider it to be depression, then you are not entirely wrong. Yes, it is one of the economic depressions that took place in the world. Are you excited to know more about this Great Depression? Let's look into it in this video. But before we get into it, make sure you smash the subscribe button to never miss out on more videos. Here we begin. The Great Depression was a significant worldwide economic depression crisis in the United States in the 1930s and lasted until 1945. The Great Depression began in 1929 in most nations and lasted until the late 1930s in other nations. It was the 20th century's longest, deepest, and most widespread slump. The Great Depression is a well-known illustration of how rapidly the global economy may deteriorate. It began in the United States after a dramatic drop in stock values that began around September 4, 1929, and culminated in the stock market crash of October 29, 1929, which made international headlines Black Tuesday. Between 1929 and 1932, the global gross domestic product, GDP, decreased by almost 15%. For instance, during the Great Recession, global GDP declined by less than 1% from 2008 to 2009. By the mid-1930s, some economies had begun to recover. However, the impacts of the Great Depression lingered in many countries until the outbreak of World War II. Both affluent and emerging countries were devastated by the Great Depression. Personal income, tax revenue, profits, and prices all decreased, while international trade declined by more than half. Unemployment in the United States has risen to 23%, with rates as high as 33% in other countries. Cities throughout the world were heavily damaged, particularly those reliant on heavy industry. In many countries, construction has come to a halt. Crop prices plunged by almost 60%, wreaking havoc on farming towns and rural areas. Areas depending on primary sector businesses, such as mining and logging, suffered the most due to falling demand and a lack of alternative sources of employment. The rapid and disastrous collapse of U.S. stock market prices, which began on October 24, 1929, is typically regarded as the spark of the Great Depression by economic historians. However, some argue that the stock market crash was a symptom of the Great Depression rather than a cause. Even after the 1929 Wall Street crash, when the Dow Jones Industrial Average fell from 381 to 198 in 2 months, there was a period of optimism. The stock market began to rise in early 1930. The Dow Jones Industrial Average recovered to 294, pre-depression levels, in April 1930, before falling gradually for years, reaching a low of 41 in 1932. Governments and corporations initially spent more in the first half of 1930 than in the previous year's similar period. On the other hand, consumers who had suffered significant losses in the stock market the previous year lowered their spending by 10%. In addition, a catastrophic drought plagued the agricultural heartland of the United States beginning in the mid-1930s. By the mid-1930s, interest rates had dropped to historically low levels, but projected deflation and people's continued aversion to borrowing meant that consumer spending and investment remained low. Automobile sales had fallen below those of 1928 by May 1930. Prices began to fall in general. However, earnings remained stable in 1930. In 1931, a deflationary spiral began. Farmers' economic prospects were worsened by falling crop prices and drought in the Great Plains. Despite federal help, nearly 10% of all Great Plains farms changed hands during the Great Depression. Causes of the Great Depression. As prices fell and a given amount of money bought more and more things, holding money became profitable, aggravating the demand reduction. According to monetarists, the Great Depression began as a normal recession. The reduction of the money supply severely exacerbated the economic situation, causing the recession to turn into the Great Depression. Economists and economic historians are almost evenly divided on whether the traditional monetary explanation that monetary forces were the primary cause of the Great Depression is correct, or whether the traditional Keynesian explanation that a drop in autonomous spending, particularly investment, was the primary cause of the Great Depression's onset is correct. Today, the debt deflation theory and the expectancies hypothesis, which add non-monetary reasons to Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz's monetary explanations, have a lot of scholarly backing. By extending the money supply and serving as lender of last resort, the Federal Reserve System could have sped up the process of monetary deflation and banking collapse. The economic downturn would have been substantially less severe and much shorter if they had done this. The spread of global depression. The fundamental transmission mechanism of the Great Depression was the gold standard. Even countries that had never experienced bank failures or monetary contraction were driven to embrace the deflationary strategy because higher interest rates in deflationary countries resulted in a gold outflow from countries with lower interest rates. Countries that lost gold but wanted to keep the gold standard had to allow their money supply and domestic price level to fall under the price-specific flow mechanism of the gold standard. There is general agreement that protectionist policies like the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act contributed to the Depression's worsening. The global depression also caused some consequences like a breakdown of international trade. Many economists believe that the dramatic drop in international trade after 1930 exacerbated the Depression, particularly for heavily reliant overseas trade. 2/3 of American economic historians thought the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act worsened the Great Depression in 1995 poll. Most historians and economists blame this act for exacerbating the Great Depression by severely restricting foreign trade and triggering retaliatory tariffs in other countries. While foreign trade accounted for a minor portion of overall economic activity in the United States and was focused on a few industries such as farming, it played a considerably larger role in many other countries. Between 1921 and 1925, the average ad valorem rate of tariffs in dutiable imports was 25.9%, but between 1931 and 1935, it soared to 50% under the new tariff. In monetary terms, American exports decreased from nearly $5.2 billion in 1929 to $1.7 billion in 1933 over the next 4 years. Hence, not only did the actual volume of exports collapse, but so did the prices. Wheat, cotton, tobacco, and lumber were among the most hit agricultural goods. Governments all across the world have taken a variety of measures to reduce their spending on imported goods, including imposing tariffs, import restrictions, and exchange controls. However, these restrictions caused a lot of friction among countries with a lot of bilateral commerce, resulting in significant export-import decreases during the downturn. Now, the turning point and recovery occurred. The recovery from the Great Depression began in most countries throughout the world in 1933. In the United States, recovery began in early 1933, but it took almost a decade to return to 1929 GNP, and the unemployment rate remained over 15% in 1940, albeit lower than the high of 25% in 1933. Economists disagree over what drove the United States' economic expansion, which lasted for most of Roosevelt's presidency, and the 1937 recession that interrupted it. Most economists agree that Roosevelt's New Deal initiatives either caused or expedited the recovery, albeit they were never aggressive enough to pull the economy out of the recession altogether. Some economists emphasized the positive effects of Roosevelt's words and actions on reflation expectations and rising nominal interest rates. The halting of a recession that began in 1937 was due to the reversal of the same reflationary efforts. The Banking Act of 1935, which effectively boosted reserve requirements, generating a monetary contraction that slowed their recovery, was one contributing policy that reversed reflation. Role of women and household economics. Women's major duty was as housewives, with a consistent flow of family income. Dealing with food, clothing, and medical care became considerably more difficult. As a result, children were postponed until families could financially support them, and birth rates decreased worldwide. During the Great Crisis, for every nation, women had a unique responsibility. World War II and recovery. Economic historians generally agree that the Great Depression ended with the outbreak of World War II. Many economists believe that government expenditure on the war caused or accelerated the recovery from the Great Depression. In contrast, others feel it played little effect in the recovery, though it did help to reduce unemployment. When the United States entered the war in 1941, it ultimately wiped out the last vestiges of the Great Depression. So that's all about the Great Depression. I hope you enjoyed watching it. Until the next video, stay tuned and subscribe for more videos like this. See you soon!